Well, on the line is the boxing commentator John Rawling, who has met Muhammad Ali. John, again, a very, very sad loss. I just wonder how you'll remember him.
Well, it is a sad loss. I mean, as a kid growing up in the 60s and early 70s, he was my sporting hero. I remember him, as you've just heard, as a very kind man, but as a supreme competitor. You talk about the fights against Joe Frazier, against George Foreman. He was an astonishing competitor inside the ring, but he was more than that, wasn't he? He was an important man for his culture. He was an important man of his time. He stood against the Vietnam draft and lost his heavyweight title for the better part of 3 years as a result of that. But he came back as a master of the sound bites, a masterful fighter, and somebody who the whole world looked up to. At one stage, you know, they said he was the most famous face, the most famous man on earth. And I think he was. He was the greatest sportsman of the 20th century for me, and arguably the greatest sportsman of all time.
Indeed. And one thing that you kind of touched on there, which people in Britain perhaps don't remember, is how much to a certain section of the American public he was absolutely loathed because he was somebody who'd converted to Islam. They didn't understand that. He was opposed to Vietnam. He was said to be unpatriotic. Those things were very, very virulent at the time in some sections of the United States.
Well, it was the 1960s, and it was at a time when the civil rights movement was reaching its fulfillment. And he was feared, I think, by a section of society. He allied himself briefly to Malcolm X, and he was reviled by parts of the sporting public, and that's why in the 1960s he had to fight around Europe. He came and fought Henry Cooper here. He fought Brian London here, Karl Mildenberger in Germany, and other fights around the world, and that was as a result of it. But of course, things changed. After 1968, after 1970, when he returned, he became the great hero, because the Vietnam crisis, the Vietnam War, was viewed in a different manner then. He'd stood against it, and suddenly, from being somebody who was feared and to an extent reviled, he came back as a hero to particularly the young generation, the student generation, and of course to black America. He was an iconic figure and became more so when he returned in the 1970s.
And I suppose the other thing that kind of amazes me is to think of somebody at the top of the world who is forced out for a few years and who manages to come back. I mean, that in itself shows an incredible determination to just get on and succeed. Well,
we probably lost the greatest years of Muhammad Ali's career when he was forced out of the sport between 1968 and 1970. But he, you know, the way he came back and fought his way back to the top, he lost to Joe Frazier the first time he fought him, but then beat him twice thereafter, culminating in Manila in 1975. But I think the fight everybody remembers above all was the fight against the then feared George Foreman in Kinshasa, Zaire, in 1974. I well remember Harry Carpenter, one of my commentating predecessors, commentating on that fight. And at the end of it, he sort of was almost overcome by the emotion and the moment. And Harry said, "Oh my God, he's won the title back at 32. I don't believe it." And that kind of summed it up. He'd confronted Foreman, who at the time was regarded as virtually unbeatable, and with those rope-a-dope tactics, he'd come off the ropes and knocked him out, won back his title. And the whole world, I think, the whole sporting world at that time in 1974, gosh, 42 years ago, but the whole sporting world rejoiced.
Indeed it did. And the whole world, in a sense, rejoiced, because people who weren't interested particularly in boxing were very interested in Muhammad Ali, and so people watched.
Well, he had an incredible crossover appeal. Some fighters since have done it to a degree, but nobody like Muhammad Ali did. If we can take the most famous sportsmen in the world now, people like the likes of Cristiano Ronaldo, Lionel Messi, Usain Bolt, you could multiply their fame combined 10 times over, and you'd kind of get to where Muhammad Ali was. He was more famous than the Beatles, and that's saying something. People used to watch who had no remote interest in boxing. The fact that Muhammad Ali was fighting was a global event. he was boxing's first international superstar, and really his impact has been nowhere near replicated anywhere since. He was so articulate as well, so funny. Those interviews with Michael Parkinson back in the 1970s, if you've never seen them, if people have never seen them, get onto YouTube and have a look at them, because they were just remarkable.
Indeed they were, and he was truly remarkable. John, thanks very much. John Rawling there. Thank you.